But let's start first of all by a statement, which I'm putting forward there, of course, to generate the discussion and provoke some insights. Peacebuilding needs to focus on change from within, rather than extent-driven reconstruction, security, and economic paradigms. Key questions are, how do we ensure sustainability? What is sustainable peacebuilding? What does it mean? Is sustainability in terms of development, such as defined by the World Bank, the IMF, the UN? How do we ensure agency from below? How do we ensure that the peace actors on the ground are actually modeling, as you said, modeling their own agency, modeling their own ownership? How do we actually get to ownership? What is local ownership? Who decides what local ownership actually means? Who does that? We, the UN, international community, or the people on the ground? How does peacebuilding address the roots of war and inequality? How does it do that? Something we have not seen in many recent cases. Not in Afghanistan, not in Somalia, not in Kosovo. We'll discuss that. How do we allow for complexity to inform contextualized approaches? How do we allow for interconnectivity to actually generate coherence, convergence, complementarity, and actually agency from below? Because the ideal that we have is that those who are affected by the conflict actually take the opportunity, seize the opportunity to build up their own agency, their own identity. Rather than us coming in, dictating what reconstruction actually means. What does security actually mean? Like I said, I come from a peacemaking world. Peacemaking has not done much of good works in the last years. Mediation has not brought about lots of change. It has mitigated conflict. But we haven't actually exchanged actors. We haven't exchanged structures. We haven't actually dealt with conflict transformation at all. The same pundits are in the same structures with the same powers. And we have used elections as the conduit to put the same people into power with the same agendas. So we haven't actually changed anything. We want to do conflict transformation. We want to do something that is close to Lederach's ideal, but we haven't done that actually. UN policies are not geared to do that kind of work. UN policies are geared towards peacekeeping, so that peacebuilding can come into place. But we have not done peacebuilding yet. So you will see lots of new research coming out, articles, publishers, publications, also through Professor Coleman's research, looking at how can we now ensure that we really talk about peacebuilding and what does it actually mean when you look at it from a complexity perspective. So peacebuilding to focus on change from within. We would say, of course, change from within. You know, the people that are affected are the PhDs of their own conflicts. They know best how to do that. But at the same time, we argue in terms of development. If you don't set up your structures and your banking system, then you don't get money. How then they change from within? Then there's no change happening. There's no individual change happening. It's a very amorphous field. Depending on where you come from, which discipline, it's going to have its own texture. Important for us, because we're living in an international environment driven by international laws, is to look at policies, international policies that actually dictate the way forward when it comes to peacebuilding. And this one has been started by Boutros Boutros-Ghali in his agenda for peace, where he says peacebuilding is the action to identify and support structures which will tend to strengthen and solidify peace in order to avoid a relapse into conflict. I think everybody agrees on the last one. We don't want actually societies that come out of war or a violent environment to lapse back into violence. Based on this definition, there has been lots of discussions and talks about this idea of what we call liberal peacebuilding. Liberal because it tends to focus on development. Development through financial aid, institution building, state building. And state building means, you know, all the structures around you that you need to have a state functioning. So imagine South Sudan. South Sudan has its independence on July 9th, 2011. Most of the people in the ministries and the government are from the bush. Unlike Somalia, where most of the people come from, I don't know, there's a 21-year-old guy. He leads the Ministry for Infrastructure and whatnot. He has a PhD from Bradford University. So most of those people in Somalia are exiles coming back into Somalia and heading little departments. Well, you know, if you think about it, if you go to Mogadishu, I mean, there's not much there anyway. And if you're lucky enough to have a proper department, then you have a little house that has a door and some windows. And that's your Ministry of Infrastructure, for example. But he is 29-year-old. He has done studies. He knows how to converse. He knows how to talk. He knows how to charm the international community. South Sudan, very different. 29. He's a PhD. I'm 21 PhD. But young, nevertheless. But in South Sudan, most of them come out of the bush into what the international community says you have to have, for example, a Ministry of Finance. Now, if you know the context of South Sudan and the different tribes and the different affiliations that they had, you ask yourself, well, how do they know about finance? Many people will say, oh, it's going to be bad, so we have to deploy more troops, more drones, and all that stuff. No. Look at some of the most violent pockets. Always have little areas and havens of peace. Peaceful actors on the ground that do lots of tremendous work. Why not identify those actors and try to support them? Somehow. We can discuss how that functions. But try to support these peace actors on the ground. Let's try to find out about those actors. You might say, well, in Rwanda, for the genocide in '94, we had at least 120 NGOs on the ground that were actually peace NGOs. They were trying to do some work. But there was no support from the UN. The UN said we don't have the mandate to support these NGOs. And they lacked everything. They lacked transportation means, they lacked helicopters, they lacked medical means. Why not support those? Mind you, Rwanda was 2 years after this definition came out. Why didn't we deploy? Why didn't we go there? Okay? So just many questions. There's no response as I have right now. We can discuss. You will find a lot of other models that criticize the liberal peace model. Communitarian critiques, and these are just a list that you can research for yourself and find, and I can give you, of course, references for all these critiques if you want to take a look at it. My question as always is, okay, I can see the criticism. I understand why, for example, it's not good to jump right away into state building. But at the same time, what are the options? What are your choices? Are you going to stand there and just watch people kill themselves, decimate themselves? How many times do you remember when the war in Bosnia broke out? And everybody said, no, never again. I remember when I was there, before I signed up for the armed forces. Bosnia for me was actually the reason why I went to the armed forces in the first place. Because right before Bosnia, there was a big argument for the Gulf War. People in the streets. When Bosnia broke out, nobody went to the streets. I remember we were 5 people in the streets demonstrating against the war in Bosnia, wanting intervention. We were at the university, you know, and coming from the school and having little candles. It was cold like this outside, and we were doing like little, you know, night watches and thinking that we would actually change anything. No. But the year before, or 2 years before, 1990, for the Gulf War, masses of people. And for Bosnia, nothing happened. Okay. So some people say, no, we cannot have this happen again. Rwanda, 94, happened again. There was a genocide. And look at other places. I mean, it's always happening, it's rehappening, it's happening all the time. So at the same time, you have to say, we need intervention, but how do we intervene? What's the quality of this kind of intervention? How do we qualify our intervention? How do we not fall into a culture of intervention? So my questions are, we have to go, we have to intervene, we cannot let things happen, but I'm not a proponent of R2P neither, because who's going to pay for the humanitarian costs in Libya or Somalia? Who's paying for that? So people are very cautious to intervene in Syria. Who's going to take the responsibility for intervention in Syria? Libya, you might say, was a bit easier, different balance of power. Of course, you might say that. But look, Mali is a direct outcome of Libya. All the weapons used by insurgents in Mali are weapons used in Libya. I work on a case for the World Bank where communities fight one another and fight a big company, and I can trace the weapons back that they use to the weapon arsenals in Libya. So there is, again, this interconnectedness. Whatever we do, intervene here, will cause an effect over there. There's a clear relationship between the US troops withdrawing out of Somalia in 92, 93, and the genocide in Rwanda in 94. The agents on the ground that were perpetrating the violence, they were waiting for something to happen. Because Burundi, Rwanda didn't just happen 2 years before the genocide, it happened 20 years already. But there was a strong force. And when Clinton said, no, we're going to get those troops back after Black Hawk Down, you know the situation, then it's all of a sudden it generated another kind of dynamical situation, kind of wave of violence. That's where all of a sudden also you find lots of researchers coming back to the whole complexity theory. What happened there? What are these bubbles of energy and systems that contradict one another? The intervention we have in Haiti has actually reference to intervention in Papua New Guinea, you know, all that stuff. In terms of peace building, for example, the challenge of rebuilding war-torn societies is to nurture and create the political, economic, and social space within which indigenous actors can identify, develop, and employ the resources necessary to build a peaceful, just, and prosperous society. This kind of definition of current peace-building evolution has found its policy-making example in the New Deal, or the MDGs, and the way that the New Deal or the MDGs for certain emerging countries are being prioritized. So for example, if you Google online, you will see the New Deal for the DRC. Will tell you, you know, by that time, the country should have built up a medical health system. And in order to get there, these steps have to be taken, and these things have to be done. So it is about identifying what are the priorities when we come to peace building, and we come to assistance from outside. What do we prioritize first in those contexts? Do we say we rebuild the entire nation? Do we say rule of law dictated by the Department of Political Affairs in the UN or the World Bank? Or do we say rule of law based on what indigenous actors have defined as their rule of law? The problem is, and that's why I talked here about gaps and capacities, how do we nurture and create the space? Because peace building is all about the local entity, the local system, being able to absorb all what's coming in terms of change and to produce something that resists the shocks and the crises without outside intervention. Although I'm a peacemaker, I have to have a peace-building hat on. And that's where interconnectors come in. As a peacemaker, I'm actually a manager of expectations. I manage not just my own mediation support team, but also manage the International Contact Group, the World Bank, the UN, the local population, political parties. I manage all these people. If I do it right, then they'll be able to actually carry the process forward without my intervention. Then they have to create their own space. They have to create their own haven, how to resist to shocks and crises for their own sake. Without my intervention, I have to lay out the ground for that. So Mali, for example, is a very, very good case in point. So follow the situation in Mali, because that's going to be a new way after Kosovo and East Timor on how the UN will look at peace building. They're trying to adopt this kind of mindset that you have to integrate peacemaking, peace building, and peacekeeping all together. You know that in terms of reaching positive peace, the segmentation between peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peacebuilding was built on Johan Galtung's ideas. And then Lederer came afterwards and refined what Galtung brought out. Of course, the question today is that do we still look at peacemaking, peacekeeping, peacebuilding as it was back in the days? Or should we just go back and look at pre-war, war, and post-war situations? That's why all of a sudden you have very, very interesting people coming in. There's Professor Coleman, but also others, who think about, okay, let's look at peace building in a non-linear way. So non-linearity is now, of course, the word of the game. What does it mean? And before going into really the complexity of the topic, and I also gave you lots of indications here where you can do your own research, but complexity and this approach to peace building says that when managing a changing environment, two of the indispensable capabilities of a complex system are, one, to store information about the environment, and second, to adapt to structures, so adaptivity, i.e. to be self-organized. Complex systems need to have the capacity to recall or somehow embody their own history, to have the memory. Yet memory is not located at a specific place, but rather distributed throughout the system. How do we instill a new memory? How do we nurture a different history? How do we come into a post-colonial environment, such as Mali? South Africa has its own colonialism, and instill a new memory. How do these identities come together and generate a new history, a new identity barrier? That's also a question, right? Identity and social systems. How do they do that? How do we allow that to happen? Yes, it is a top-down, bottom-up approach, but there is more in this. There's much more stories that come together to build up a structure, to build up a context. Now, how do we do that? How do we get there? So in complexity, for example, there's the so-called determined complexity school. They say if we gather enough data and enough computer power, we can generate enough mathematical alterations so we can understand at some point the big picture. And they're pursuing that. There's then the critical complexity theory. They say, no, we can't do that. Influence and likelihood is something you cannot compute. It's going to happen anyway. So they are rather argue from a position of power and influence, and what are certain likely behaviors, likely motivations, likely attitudes. And we have to adapt quickly to those if we want to understand those. But more importantly, we have to understand how are these structures able to adapt? How do they store the information? So if I go to South Sudan, for example, and I work with different actors on the ground, I'm asking myself when I go back to South Africa or to New York, what do they do with what I told them? What do they do with that change? Have I actually created an environment where knowledge sharing and best practice is actually managed? Knowledge sharing is very important. Reflective practices, how do we create that? So when someone comes to me, a donor, and says, you know what, I'll give you $2 million to conduct 25 trainings over a period of 3 years. I said, I'm not going to do 25 trainings. I'm going to do maybe 3 trainings, 1 training per year, and the rest will be mentoring. Mentoring. That is a key what we're trying to do, for example, with UNDP and so-called local mediators or insider mediators in Somalia. That they start generating their own stories, their own context, their own memories. They become resilient themselves. You find lots of this resilience research in river management, the Nile management, or Zambezi river management. Research has proven that this kind of storytelling is actually quite key to generate resilience in the system, to generate their own memory, to generate adaptivity to structures. They then start organizing their own structures. We might have an idea of a democracy or a rule of law, and we have to allow the local communities to have their own ideas of rule of law. What does it mean? I can come with my ideas, because I'm the intervener, but you are the intervened upon, the subdominant. What is going to be your discourse? Do I accept your discourse? Or do I say, no, the World Bank said, by this time you have to reach this. That's why in Africa, for example, they don't talk about peacekeeping the way that the UN talks about peacekeeping, right? Peacekeeping for the UN is between 2 people, 2 parties, 2 entities, keep the peace. Let the ceasefire mediation work its way, and then there will be elections, and then, ta-da, a new state, right? That's what they did in Kosovo and East Timor. That's the blueprint. Worked perfectly well. That was the blueprint, right? That's how it's supposed to function. Yeah, well, it doesn't really function like that in every place. That's why the Africans have said, well, no, it's not going to be called peacekeeping for us. It's going to be called peace support operations. Peace support operations is a war situation. It's peace enforcement through the means of war. The Africans say, our context is dictated by different dynamics, certainly the post-colonial dynamic, and all these tensions and trauma is building up to something very violent. We have to have a force that comes in between, separates the party. So an African mediator is always a very strong mediator in the sense that he has a very robust mandate and a very robust force in the background. Mali is a perfect example. The president of Burkina Faso is not a mediator. He has a very strong force backed up by France. The US is providing drones and inter-air operability, and it's the best he can do. Time machine. Excellent. That's the best they can do. That's the way currently how mediation is functioning is going to happen for the next 10 years at least. But the problem is, again, how do we bring peace, positive peace in the narrative? Afghanistan is not going to happen in 50 years. South Sudan is not going to happen in 100 years in terms of what we think universal social norms are about. Before they're really having their own memory, their own history, their own identity, it's going to take time, a lot of time. So time should not be our worry. Time is not the problem. There's a great movie, The Fifth Element. You know about it, by Luc Besson. In the beginning, these aliens land, and then they are supposed to save a key or save a certain artifact. And then one guy says, "Boy, we're running out of time." And then this alien says, "Time is not the essence. Time is not the problem." Because they have been building up their history for a longer generation than actually the human beings were there for in the story. And that's the same in sustainable peace building. It's not about time. It's not about if you see peace coming about in South Sudan. It's not going to be about you. It's not going to be about the individual at all. It's going to be about the organization, the group, the community. How do they do that? How do they learn? How do they adapt? How do they build interconnectivity? Not only between themselves, but also to other systems outside. How do all these agents work together? How do they build up their own identity? How does it happen? How does it function? What do we do as peace builders to do that? Are we focusing on youth? Are we focusing on women? Are we focusing on reconciliation? What do we do? How do we do that? Forms and practice of peace building are dictated by external determinants. Those are the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, the US in large parts, but also the European Union. Those actors dictate how peace building is supposed to function in certain emerging states, fragile states, you name it. There's a certain decline in that narrative because you have another narrative coming up, which is built up by the BRIC states: Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa. They are looking at a non-interventionist model of peace building, where they say, no, we have to focus on local ownership. That's why you have an African Union that says African solutions to African problems. And that will come up more and more. And you will see it will actually put aside the narrative coming from the World Bank, the US, the IMF, let's say the liberal peace-building model. Currently, again, we have a peace-building practice that leads to achievement of negative peace. It is focusing much more on peacekeeping and on how peacekeeping, through the means of elections, rebuilds a state. But peacekeeping is not peace. It's not instilling peace per se. It keeps the parties apart, but doesn't do anything for the Dilrock type of conflict transformation that you are seeking. What's the transformation about? And again, if you do transformation, you have to start with individual. That's where it starts. The individual. That means when we do training, we train an organization, for example, but it starts with individuals first. And that is a very, very difficult thing to do. I'm not sure who of you people are working in training. I know Beth is in training. But if you start with individual to really change organizations, how do you do that? It's actually quite difficult. So sometimes you work with the proxies of agents of change or champions. But who are these people? Who determines who a champion is? Is it going to be me, the mentor, who determines that you are a champion of change? How do I do that? What we need is to explore the potential of indigenous peacemaking. Bring back traditional means of peacemaking. Not peacebuilding. I'm writing a peacemaking with a certain purpose. Peacemaking. Bring back the peacemakers. They are the conduits, the generators of stories, structures, and context that will lead to positive peace, to building peace in their societies. But you have to, first of all, try to endorse these traditional means of peacemaking. Local mediators, places such as West Africa that have been under influence of French colonialism for a long time, they have a very rich practice of indigenous peacemaking, a very rich practice. Why don't we use those practices? Mexico, Colombia, if you look at the ADR story, from an ADR perspective in law, you find lots of research on how local communities, local courts are actually making very nice work in Mexico, in Colombia, in Guatemala. Why don't we use the same kind of situation in political science? Why do we have to use always the rational actor perspective? Who's an rational actor in a violent environment? You're a rational actor? So the emphasis is here on post-conflict transformation. In conflict transformation, you have also 3 ideas: prescriptive, elicitive, and inductive approach. Inductive is, again, the agency from within. Don't teach the PhDs of their own conflict what they have to do to resolve the conflict. You assist them. You're like a therapist. You know, that's the other part of mediation, the therapist. You just help them. You assist them to see a different perspective. Mediation is exactly working at this dangerous border of trying to change perception and perspective. It's very difficult to do. It's very hard work to do. And I have seen in research and activities that women are actually better to do that than men. That's why I said, Laverna, we have to look at how do we actually build up AU female lead mediators. They're better of restoring something. They're better at communicating a change of perspective than their male counterparts. And it has, of course, to do with a bigger narrative, masculinities and feminities, something we can also discuss. But it has to come from within and with respect for the other. Do no harm is one thing, and that's fine, of course. Intervention by whom, for the sake of whom, dictated by whom. But respect for the other is actually much more important than do no harm. Because if I respect the other, I won't do harm at all. I will come and I will ask a question. I won't dictate. Like I'm fighting with my counterparts in South Africa all the time when they come and say, no, we are going to have 40 trainings a year. I said, no 40 trainings a year. We do 4 trainings. We bring together, identify the knowledge, allow the learning environment. So I'm moving away personally from training to learning. I'm starting to hate the word training. I don't know what training actually does. It doesn't change anything, training. We're trying to skill up a certain person to function according to certain performance criteria. But we don't change anything. Because we haven't asked the person, what do we need to change in you? We haven't. So how about moving from training away, moving away from capacity building to knowledge sharing, and providing a learning environment? That means, in terms of training, it is the participants who design their own training. It's a very new way to see things. And it's not just starting now, it started a couple of years ago. But it's about the practitioners in the field of academia, education, and of course practice, to take all these ideas and to say, we have to relook at how we do certain things. We have to go as NGOs back to the donors and tell them our narrative has to be different. When we do training, we're going to look at something different. Because donors will come and say, well, we give tax money, we want to see results at the end of the day, results-based management. That's fair, but it doesn't change anything. And the donors, and we have to do better work at being a better advocate for our target audience that we know much better than the donor do. How do we do that? That's where it starts. That's where Peacebuilding 2.0 starts. It starts with us and how we're going to reach out to the other with respect to the other. And how do we engage in those things?